You guys have been sending in a bunch of random Titanic questions lately, so now it's time for more generally accepted Titanic facts. If you don't agree with any of these, feel free to leave a comment and I'll ignore it. Number 1. Full speed astern. Probably the most famous scene in the biggest movie about Titanic. No, not that scene. Come on now. Come on. The most famous and exciting scene is when the ship hits the iceberg. And all things considered, it's pretty darn accurate, especially for the knowledge that Titanic historians and experts had at the time of filming. You always gotta remember that when you are critical about this movie. But one thing that is incorrect about the orders given are the engine commands. First Officer William Murdoch orders the helm turned hard to starboard to avoid the iceberg, which turns the ship to port. These are called tiller commands. It's an older method of calling out commands, but it's correct. In the movie, in most movies, and practically all movies, the next order given is full speed astern for the engines. This would have stopped the engines and then reversed them. However, this bit of information doesn't come from the most reliable source, only because he wasn't there at the time. Fourth Officer Boxall was approaching the bridge at the time of the impact, and claimed later at the inquiry that the engines were at full astern. But deep down in boiler room number 6, leading stoker Barrett heard the telegraph bell ring out and the red light for stop illuminate. Immediately, Barrett jumped into action, called out to shut all the dampers, and almost instantaneously he saw the starboard hull plates give way as the iceberg grazed by. While Boxall was heading towards the bridge, he certainly heard Murdoch's commands to turn Titanic away and the ringing of the engine telegraphs, but he only assumed the command given was full stern. Barrett, down at ground zero, saw the actual command given. Murdoch, having been on Olympic, knew that there was no time to fully reverse Titanic's engines, nor was it in her best interest, and the reality was that the engines played relatively no part whatsoever in the maneuver to avoid the iceberg. It was just too late by the time any commands were given. Number 2. Copied Ship of Dreams. Oh boy, again with the most luxurious ship in the world thing, which is subjective by the way. But when I read comment after comment that Titanic was decked out to the nines, with glamorous accommodation and brand new state-of-the-art decors, I get a little frustrated. I'm going to break some hearts and ruin Titanic again for some people. Titanic wasn't as luxurious as you might think. True, the grand staircase, lounge, smoke room, restaurant, all those first-class spaces and period cabins were indeed fabulous, and sometimes a little over the top. But they weren't all over the ship, nor were they sometimes Titanic exclusive. And I'm not even arguing that it's a Titanic Olympic thing. Pretend Titanic is a modern-day cruise ship from a modern-day cruise line. It has staples that passengers love, like buffets, ballrooms, pools, casinos, whatever, all done in a certain style and decor. Then the cruise line decides to build a bigger ship for more passengers. They decide to include the same rooms which they know the public loves on their new ship, but increase them in size. This is what happened with the Olympic class. You can find smaller versions of a lot of their grand spaces on earlier ships, from the grand staircase to lounge, gymnasium and swimming bath. White Star Line was a stickler for loving the phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Number 3. Titanic's band. No musical group in history was as famous as Titanic's band until the Beatles came around. These men played until the ship sank from under them to calm passengers, provide comfort, lift spirits. Like most things surrounding Titanic, there are a number of myths with these musical men. While usually they played in 2 groups, a trio and quintet, they possibly came together that night in several places for the passengers. First in the lounge, then for a long time on the top level of the grand staircase, by the piano. And then when things were looking grim, outside on deck. From ragtime music to hymns and patriotic themes, they played a lot that night. The most famous song is Nearer My God to Thee, which does seem to be the last piece the band played, as there are overwhelmingly more accounts from passengers remembering that hymn than anything else. Wallace Hartley, the band leader, told a friend before the disaster that if he was ever on a sinking ship, that he would either play O God, Our Help in Ages Past, or Nearer My God to Thee. The one thing the movies have gotten wrong so far is the version of Nearer My God to Thee. Being Methodist, it's most likely that Wallace would have known and performed Arthur Sullivan's Propria Deo version, not Bethany, known in the United States, or Horbury, which you can hear in A Night to Remember. Number 4. The Unsinkable ship sinks. Oh, this is an easy one. Or is it? Titanic's unsinkable claim came long after she sank, right? Why can't anything with Titanic be cut and dry? As it turns out, both Titanic and Olympic, of course, were claimed by White Star and Harlan and Wolff to be unsinkable. This can be found in brochures, articles, and even by some of both companies' top officials. Infamously, Shipbuilder magazine way back in 1911 made one of the first claims which states, "These vessels are designed to be unsinkable, and the watertight doors made them practically unsinkable." Yeah, I hear you. A few people reading a shipbuilding magazine, and it only says designed to be and practically, which doesn't necessarily mean 100% unsinkable. Whatever, I'll keep going. The New York Times ran an article in 1910 saying the same thing about Olympic, practically unsinkable. Now that's a much bigger target audience. Titanic is mentioned in the article, briefly, not by name, but as Olympic's younger sister, so she too is called practically unsinkable here. But who else said Titanic was unsinkable? Captain Smith said it a couple times, a direct quote being, "The Olympic is unsinkable, and Titanic will be the same." Dozens of passengers boarding Titanic wrote letters to loved ones, how they were about to sail on this brand new unsinkable ship. They had to have heard it somewhere, but one of the most powerful unsinkable claims was made right after the disaster. Not even 12 hours had elapsed when Philip Franklin, vice president of the International Mercantile Marine, was being overrun by reports about the ship hitting an iceberg. Franklin had no idea Titanic had sunk yet, and making a statement to newspapermen said, "She is absolutely unsinkable, and it makes no difference what she hits." Several hours later, when the news was confirmed to him, he made one more statement to the press, in tears. "I thought her unsinkable. I do not understand it." Number 5. White Star, Gold Star. Those rich and greedy shareholders at White Star probably all went broke after Titanic sank, huh? Greed and money, class and poverty, some of the fun stuff of Titanic's story. But what about White Star's survival after Titanic went down? Many assumed the company was in ruins and had to merge with their rival, Cunard, but that wasn't until the mid-1930s in the height of the Great Depression. The facts are these. White Star was the more profitable of the two big shipping lines, beating Cunard with record profits the year following the Titanic disaster. If they had financial woes, the construction of Britannic would have been a problem, but it wasn't. They were helped by being part of the International Mercantile Marine, a conglomerate of several shipping lines. But overall, White Star was doing much better than IMM as a whole. But what about the loss of Titanic? Surely all the money lost in lawsuits cost them everything. How would they ever financially recover? While yes, Titanic was not fully insured, IMM and White Star had to cover the rest of it. But White Star only had to cover 1/5 of the cost, or about £108,000, equivalent to £12.5 million today. This might seem like a great sum, but it was only 1/9 the profit they reported in 1912. White Star Line might have had a disastrous PR year, but 1912 was pretty good for the bank. Number 6. Lifeboats cutting corners. I thought I already mentioned this, but let's do it again. Did Titanic's owners remove boats so the first class could have an uncluttered deck? Let's do some math lessons. Titanic, and of course Olympic, had originally designed for lifeboats called Design D, made up in 1908. There were 8 lifeboats on each side of the ship, 16, evenly divided on the first and second class promenades. Jump forward to Titanic 1912, and her finalized boat plan has 20 total boats. This is because the ship went through design changes, and both her total passenger and crew occupancies went up and down. Math time! Design D, the original layout, called for a total ship capacity of 3,979, and lifeboat space for 999. A proportion of 24.9 of the ship's capacity could fit in the lifeboats. Now her realized 1912 layout had a total capacity of 3,415, due to lower passenger accommodations, and a lifeboat capacity of 1,178, 19% greater due to more boats. Due to this, a total of 34.5% of the ship's overall capacity could fit in these boats, up 10%. While this didn't allow space for everyone in the boats, it was more than the Board of Trade and the laws called for at the time. So, there was no cutting of boats due to cost nor appearance. Titanic actually had more boats than originally designed, so stop saying Titanic's boats were removed. Number 7. The leadership of Captain E.J. Smith. Why does Captain Smith get the short end of the stick? Is it because he was the captain of the Titanic? Media and film present E.J. Smith as an inept and weak captain, unable to take the lead in loading the lifeboats nor help his officers during the process. Indeed, it took Titanic an hour after the first collision to lower the first boat, and it was less than half full. Should the buck stop with Captain Smith? Let's take a quick look at what he was doing that night. Immediately, Captain Smith entered the bridge, seconds after the collision. He went off to inspect his ship twice to see just how bad the iceberg impact had on Titanic. He made certain to warn the wireless officers of the situation. He ordered his crew to prepare the boats and muster the passengers, and then he allowed his officers to do their work on either side of Titanic, checking up on them and ordering passengers to the boats throughout the night. Periodically, he would go to the wireless office, ordered emergency rockets fired, and attempted to call back half-filled boats. He was also present to help fill and lower several of them. The man worked hard through the morning of April 15th. There's no evidence to support any of the more dramatic stories that this was a man in shock after being given a devastating blow for putting his faith in technology and science. This was a man of the sea who had experience of almost 50 years. Number 8. SOS Titanic.
Try sending SOS, that's the new call. And maybe the only chance you'll ever have.
Oh yes, you send that SOS call, Phillips. It's brand new and it will be the first one ever transmitted. Or is it? Morse code has plenty of advantages, but sometimes letters are a little confusing, especially all those dots and dashes and pauses. CQD, the main distress call and the first one used by Titanic that night, generally stands for Attention All Stations, CQ, Distress, D. Those letters aren't all that clear and memorable. CQD wasn't a universal standard, just one that was used by operators frequently. In 1906, at the International Wireless Telegraph Convention in Berlin, SOS was proposed as replacement. It was much simpler. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. See, you will remember that. I just saved your life. It was adapted jolly quick by the Germans, but not so much by the Brits. So by Bride's perspective, it could have been brand new. But Titanic didn't use it first. The earliest report of SOS being broadcast via Marconi Wireless was 3 years earlier, when SS Arapahoe broke her propeller shaft and needed help. After that event, SOS was used a couple more times, but like many things, Titanic made the call sign famous. Number 9. J. Brute Ismay. Believe it or not, humans are not usually a one-dimensional and flat stereotypical archetype. Actions and behaviors are often gray and confusing, but media, not just movies, but all media, love to paint things black and white for our dough brains. Case in point, Mr. Joseph Bruce Ismay is perhaps the face of the Titanic disaster for cowardice, shame, and greed. Ismay was quickly labeled as a scapegoat of the sinking in newspaper reports, a weak shell of a man pushing for speed records, cutting costs in boats, sometimes even dressing up as a woman to snake his way into a lifeboat. While true, Mr. Ismay left the sinking Titanic in one of the last lifeboats, leaving nearly 1,500 to die on a ship he was considered the owner and manager of. It was after he spent all night attempting to fill lifeboats with passengers, sometimes getting in the way of officers, doing his best to get people off of his sinking ship. There is some debate still going on whether or not he was ordered into the last lifeboat or just took the chance to get in, but he did find a spot, instead of adding to the death toll. When word reached New York of his survival, it was the American newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst who began a smear campaign. 20 years before Titanic, Ismay was working at the New York office of the White Star. Known for being a quiet man, Ismay refused to cooperate with Hearst and his newspaper reporters. Unfortunately for Mr. Ismay, he made an enemy of Hearst, one of the most powerful men in America, and Hearst didn't forget it. His newspaper ran articles destroying Ismay's name. The public and attitude in the United States were so against Ismay that it became largely considered a fact that he was a villainous coward. He resigned from White Star, lived a solitary life in England where the press was much less critical of him, and passed away in 1938. Number 10. Rapid Fire Titanic Fake News. There was no mummy aboard Titanic. That means no curse, but there was dragon's blood in the cargo hold. I'll let you Google it. Thomas Andrews wasn't comatose nor useless at the end in the smoke room staring at a painting. He was last seen on the bridge with Captain Smith. White Star ships weren't considered unlucky nor cursed. No one person was lucky or unlucky enough to have survived the Titanic, the Lusitania, the Hindenburg disasters, and 9/11. Stop it. Think for a moment. Titanic did not break below the surface of the water. We have over 75 people saying they witnessed it happen. Titanic's yard number reflected into the water was not No Pope. Titanic's yard number was 401. That's nonsense. John Jacob Astor was not crushed by the fall of a funnel. His body was not found covered in ash. Titanic's mail clerks weren't trapped below saving mail, and neither were the engineers keeping the lights on. They all left at the last moments to save themselves after bravely manning their posts. By all accounts that night, an officer did use a gun to commit suicide. Unfortunately, there isn't enough evidence for us to identify which officer that was. No, Titanic's rudder wasn't too small. If it was, why didn't they make Britannics bigger? J.P. Morgan, the Jesuits, the White Star Line, aliens, time travelers, a U-boat, Godzilla? None of the aforementioned sunk Titanic. No, just no. An iceberg did. So, there's a bunch of facts for you. They aren't over the top, glamorized, or sensationalized. They are a few nuggets of truth about Titanic. And if it goes against what you thought you knew, well, there's always an opportunity to learn in life. Titanic will always have more to teach. For Titanic University, I'm Matthew DeWinkler, and remember, the truth is found when men are free to pursue it.